There's an interesting question related to Mohnish, which is related to position sizing, which is Mohnish had this foray into Turkey, right, where he gets incredibly excited about all these unbelievably cheap stocks in the midst of hyperinflation. And you were saying to me at the time, like, I can't believe Mohnish doesn't understand, the macroeconomics of this. And if he'd had a different education, maybe he would have been more sensitized to this stuff. And Mohnish is quietly picking up stuff like Reysas, that was like just absurdly cheap and now has made him a fortune. And it may actually be that you were right, given your temperament, not to buy something like Reysas. Or maybe it should have been a 1% position. I don't know. Can you talk us through where you diverged from Mohnish on that, and when you look back on it now, whether, even though it was the wrong decision in certain ways not to buy Reysas, whether for you actually it was the right decision, given your temperament, your desire to survive, and the like?
So I'm going to take you through a set of extremely rational, well thought out reasons why investments in Turkey should not make it into, say, my portfolio. And I will take you through that. But the listener and William, you need to be aware that this may just be a rationalization of what is going on in my lower brain that is subconscious.
How to make the decision bearable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that before I go into that, it's really important to realize or to be aware that if you have something that can go up 20x, but there's potential for complete 100% downside, what is wrong with making it a 1% position? That's okay. And I think that in the circumstances of my very rational evaluation of the idea that I didn't want to be in Turkey, for some reason, I in my mind, I was saying that if I don't do 5%, I'm not going to do it at all. And 5% probably would have been too much for me. But there's nothing in the rule book that says it couldn't have been a 1% position. My decision not to get involved in Turkey was to some degree based on my evaluation of the country, which is an authoritarian regime that imprisons journalists and has a history that is deeply problematic for me, in that Turkey as a country seems to regularly suppress its history. It's suppressed.
But China does the same, and yet you're heavily invested in China.
Yes, that is a contradiction. And in Turkey, two of my greatest objections to the way they suppress history is the history of Christianity in Turkey, and one of the founding places of Christianity is Constantinople, but that history is suppressed. The history of the Armenian genocide is suppressed in a way that doesn't seem to be healthy. And to your point, William, a whole culture of the Uyghurs is being suppressed in China. And my experience of being in China is an attempt to talk political matters with very, very intelligent people at Peking University and Tsinghua University, so these are smart students, is that it's met with a blank stare, in that this is just not a subject. It would be like you try to talk to me about human cells and human biology, for example. I barely understand what ATP is, and there's some people who studied biochemistry know a lot, but you'd meet with a blank stare. And my response to that is that, in part, it's kind of my deep respect for Charlie Munger and Charlie Munger's statements that there are different ways to kill the mouse or kill the cat, in the words of one of the Chinese leaders, and that China has a system that works for it, and that I have been indoctrinated in a certain way by my education, and I have to respect China's approach. Although on the other hand, I'm a big supporter of an organization called UN Watch, where the founder has deep, deep issues and problems, as many human rights organizations do, with China's treatment of minorities like the Uyghurs. And in my reading of China is that, and the ends ought not to justify the means. That's a deep moral principle that I think that I've learned. And in a certain way, the conclusion in China is that because they're lifting so many people out of poverty, in a certain way, the ends perhaps do justify the means, or there's an acceptance of that. There's also something about it being a superpower on a path to somewhere that creates stability and certainty for investing in that environment, whereas somehow when you're a medium or small-sized country that is engaging in human rights violations, it does get treated differently. And I know that my human rights friends would be very angry with me for saying this, but on a pure evaluation of investments, I do think that merits a different evaluation. A small country engaging in human rights violations is different. And yes, you brought up in the pause that in the case of Turkey, it seems to me that this populist leader who engages in many actions to ensure his power with the Muslim population, or with a traditional population, if you like, is engaging in acts which appear to me to be economic insanity, including increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates in the face of raging hyperinflation. And so, and what was explained to me just verbally in conversations with Mohnish is that effectively vast proportions of the economy are dollarized, and so the hyperinflation really doesn't have any impact at all, in that when you come to real estate contracts on significant pieces of real estate with foreign multinationals, the whole contract is priced in dollars, so it's moot point what the inflation rate is. But my conclusion was that a country like that can tip over the edge in one way or another. When I started observing Turkey, the Turkish army was kind of understood to be in control of the country and provided political and therefore economic stability for the country. But now there was this populist in charge, and where could it go from there? It could go to some extraordinarily difficult places. I think that one of the extraordinary mental qualities I think both you and I admire in Mohnish is that he's able to go into such situations and see an unchangeable truth. And he can wipe away all of that, all of those things that would make, he likes to joke about it, would make me go into a bomb shelter, and focus on that thing. And that thing was that this was an entrepreneurial family that controlled the shares of this company, who had very, very valuable real estate and very valuable relationships with people who wanted that real estate. And in retrospect, as best I understand, the unfolding of the war with Ukraine and the call-up of troops in Russia has meant that many people have left Russia, and Turkey is one of the places that they've come to, driving up real estate values. So I had principled reasons for not wanting to be involved in Turkey. But I think that it behooves people like me to go into something like that and do the second and the third step of analysis. And I'm not sure if it'll make it into my annual letter, but I think it is a mistake of omission. I think it's worthy of analysis. And that does not mean that I have to go and become a huge investor in Turkey, but it's my job. I spent a lot of time trying to understand crypto. It was my job to understand crypto. And if it was my job to understand crypto, we know what Charlie thinks of crypto, it's my job to understand Turkey in a much deeper way than I did, and to investigate. I'd rather be investigating Turkey and a company like Reysas than, or it's equally important for me to do that as it is to try and understand unit economics valuation models. And I didn't do that. And that doesn't mean I had to invest. So
we were talking about Mohnish the other day, and you told me about an email that he had sent you where you were talking about lessons from your mutual friend Li Lu, who made an early and immensely successful investment in BYD. And you were talking about, so how are we going to do more of this? How are we going to find more companies like this? And Mohnish sent you this remarkable reply where he was saying, well, look, nose to the grindstone. And he said, if I do 50 deep dives a year, then every 4 years or so, something like Reysas will appear that's going to make a huge difference. And I've been talking to you a lot this last few days about how you set yourself up for the next 10 years. And we've been discussing this question of what do you actually need to make it a successful 10-year period? You're 25 years into the run of the Aquamarine Fund. It's been a very successful period. A lot of funds have died along the way. You've managed to survive and outperform the market. But looking forward to the next 10 years, when you think about this question of how many deep dives you need, how many winners you need, whether you only need one big winner, one BYD, or you need 5 good ideas. How do you think about this question of what's actually going to determine your success over the next decade?
And so I think that for the listener's interest, you've helped drive my thinking and its evolution. And so, I like countries like Switzerland. I like structured environments. That doesn't mean that it can be any structure. It should be a structure that drives me towards my goals. And I realize now that if you take a guy Spier 25 years ago or 15 years ago, I was able to operate as a lone wolf, if you like, on the hunt for prey, on the hunt for the juicy stuff. And I've been through a period where I've had to be regulated like we all do. And that actually initially smothered me in that the way the regulations were implemented by well-meaning people smothered that hunt. For understandable reasons, the regulators in the world's developed financial markets decided that they had an interest in having a whole bunch of things in place around people like me. And that drew an enormous amount of energy away from me and took away from the ability to be a lone wolf hunting. What that message from Mohnish brings up, and is that now he does this naturally, and he has a capacity to structure his life without having external structure, is that to succeed, you can't just be a lone wolf hunting the shiniest thing that looks like it's going to be a success. You want to send up processes around you that enable you to do it. And when you bring up 50 company deep dives, in a certain way, it's applying a process, a sales funnel that you would normally apply to potential customers to investment ideas. And so he's setting up a funnel for himself, and he's very, very good. He taught me a lot about how to set up a funnel, except the funnel is not, say, investors or buyers of your product. It's investment opportunities. And so I am excited, given where I am right now, to structure my environment such that those funnels are far better defined and are far more likely to lead me to juicy prey, to use the hunting wolf analogy. And that doesn't mean that it has to be one funnel, that the ideas only come in from one place. They can come in from multiple different kinds of source. What I've said in the past, people say, how do you find investment ideas? And my response was basically predicated on natural human curiosity. And it was this idea that new ideas, because they're new ideas, source themselves in unusual ways. If you're looking for them in the same places, they're unlikely to source themselves. They're unlikely to be good ideas. So the example I've brought up in the past is that a company screens well, meaning that all the best ideas out of that particular screen have been picked off and are no longer in the screen. And what is left are all the ideas that appear to look good in terms of the screen, but they're underlying factors that are no good. But unbridled curiosity, looking everywhere, also isn't going to cut it. So, defining those processes of what are going to allow you, and I think that it's a huge shift in opinion. If you think of Mohnish, who really convinced me when I'd first met him of this idea of not meeting management, it's a 180-degree turn to actually meet with management. And, I'll never stop saying this. One of the most important things that anybody who's read my book should understand is that in my book, I talk about not meeting management, and that is wrong. You should certainly meet management. Meet them at the right time in the right way and in a way that they can't influence you. So
it's about being appropriately skeptical. And likewise, you have this extraordinary advantage as an investor that you have access to this incredible ecosystem of people coming at you and sharing ideas. So you'll hear Mohnish talking about Reysas. You'll hear Li Lu talking about Mautai in the old days, or BYD, or really smart friends like Brian Lawrence and Josh Tarasoff and the like, Girish Baku, who I think came up with the idea for Crystal many years ago.
Yes.
So in a way, the challenge is you've got to be open to all of this stuff and yet somehow remain discriminating enough, discerning enough, skeptical enough that you do what works for you.
Yeah, and structuring that information environment is an endless process of refinement. When you talk about some of those people, they're some of the smartest people that I know, some of the deepest and thoughtful analysts of businesses. I went through a certain period where I was not embedded in such a wonderful group of people, and I assumed that if I'd heard the idea, it must be bad, because all of the people I was dealing with were D.H. Blair type people, perhaps, and it required for me to update my model of the world to understand that actually I was embedded in a group of really, really discerning people. But when it comes to talking to CEOs, you just want to, it's not just being skeptical, you this idea that the first idea in your brain is the one that sticks. So you want to do an appropriate amount of reading about them, about what they're saying, about what their company's doing before you meet with them. So you can, the first idea, the first impression is from written materials that the company has produced before you speak to the company management. And that is the best way. It's not just about being skeptical, it's about arming yourself with knowledge that you compare to what the CEO or the CFO of the business is saying. But I think that this, I mean, you know, and first of all, the question you asked me when you arrived is a really, really good question. And it made me reevaluate William Green. So I probably pushed the world too much into the world of literary types and mathematical types. William, and I say this, you have a very, very firm grasp of the mathematics of finding one or two good ideas a year and what they can do if they go up many times. I think that many people don't even have that mathematical grasp. And so William made the very...
Guy is just trying to make up for the fact that he insulted my mathematical incompetence recently.
Yeah, but I think that you overdo it, actually. You really overdo it. So it's easy to insult in a certain way because you kind of want to be insulted in it, in the same way that I enjoy being insulted in my literary abilities. But it reminded me of how important it is to find those ideas, because as you said, that is what is going to drive the future much more than having a well-functioning team that complies with the regulations that we have to comply with, for example.
Yeah, that stuff's really important too, but everything in a sense for you has to be oriented around finding a handful of great ideas over the next few years. And that means managing yourself, managing your ecosystem of friends and investors, and managing your mood, managing your access to sunlight, managing your exercise. But it all in some ways is directed towards finding a handful of great ideas.
Yeah. I want to turn this around because I think you're at the end of your questions.
Okay, you can ask one final question, and then because we have about 23 people waiting for Guy downstairs, I'm going to let you go after that.
So one of the things, and it's really been such an amazing time to spend with William. It's been more intense for me than usual, but William, I realize that you in the last few years have gone through a transformation of your ecosystem. And I just think I have not understood the power of the platform that you now have underneath you. And I believe that it will continue to grow. But maybe it is interesting for everybody to hear the story of how you were a kind of a nameless, not completely nameless, but a less well-known figure, although extraordinarily talented, writing for publications like Time and others. And that kind of external structure collapsed around you. And so in the past few years now, you have built your own platform and your own brand. And I'm just curious for you to describe what that feels like for you and where it's going from here.
What happened to me is I had this pretty successful career as a journalist. And so I'd written for all of these publications, starting very young, for the New Yorker and the London Spectator, and then The Economist and Time and Fortune and Forbes and stuff. And I felt kind of a big shot because I became an editor at Time. I edited the Asian edition of Time and then the European, Middle East, and African edition of Time. And then I got laid off in the middle of the financial crisis. And then I spent a period of time when I was sort of lost and broken in some ways because the magazine business had collapsed and I had to reinvent myself. And in a sense, my closeness to you partly came from the fact that I helped you with writing The Educational Value Investor at a time when I was incredibly bruised. And so that was part of my reinvention. So I did that with you, and then I helped as a ghostwriter on several other books. And in some miraculous way, it kind of led to this odd transformation in my life. And I then wrote The Great Minds of Investing, which led me to interview a lot of great investors again, which is something I'd always been passionate about. but had got away from while I was editing the international editions of Time. And then that led me to write Richer, Wiser, Happier, which really enabled me to deepen some of the exploration that we'd had in your book, where you were talking about what does it actually mean to have a rich and successful life? How does investing fit into that? What can you learn from these people like Warren and Charlie? And so I kind of went deep on that, focusing on 40 or so people instead of just your career and what you'd learn from the great models in your career. And that has then spawned this podcast, which enables me to continue having these questions with remarkable people like you, or like Ray Dalio, or Mohnish, or so many extraordinary people. And so for me, it's just been fascinating to feel this thing unfold, and to go from I mean, if there's any takeaway, I think it's just we really don't know what's coming, and so you have to have the flexibility to change. It goes back to something Howard Marks talked to me about, where you have to accommodate yourself to reality as it is, not as you want it to be. And I think that's what both of us are trying to do as investors, as writers in life. The game changes, and you're constantly having to say, well, this is the hand I've been dealt. How am I going to play it wisely? And now I find myself in this beautiful position where, thanks to Stig Brodersen and Preston Pysh, who founded the Investors Podcast Network, I get to enjoy these conversations and then to share what I've figured out from these conversations with great investors. So it's a total transformation, but it's in some ways a continuation. And it only makes sense when you look back at it. You must have had the same thing where when you look back and you see how your period at D.H. Blair, where you got knocked off course, led to your discovery of Warren Buffett and this different way of doing business, and that led to you writing your book and setting up your fund, and it all seems almost logical and inevitable in retrospect. But while you're going through it, you're lost half the time, you're confused, you're failing, it's like Churchill saying that success is basically blundering from failure to failure without apparent loss of confidence, or something along those lines.
And it's
it's been a strange and interesting path.
It's also to go to Psalm 23. You kind of went through a career valley that I think I can't. It certainly lasted 5 years, maybe even 10 years. And I think of Psalm 23. Even I go through the valley of fear of the valley of death, something like that.
And shall know no evil, that sort of thing.
And Winston Churchill says, if you find yourself in hell, the best thing to do is to just keep going. And I want to share something that I think is really interesting. So when those brands collapsed and were no longer your kind of external scaffolding, so you should know that William prepares for 6 hours or more for every one of these interviews.
Oh no, days. Yeah.
Days. And the quality of these interviews is the result of that enormous amount of preparation. And William, through your training as a writer, you understand things that I will never understand, like a narrative arc. And these podcasts, I believe, have a narrative arc from beginning to end. When we were rewriting most of my book, William was explaining to me how a chapter has a narrative arc and there's a payoff at the end, but there's a setup at the beginning. So William, I think that what I discover is that the skills you had, highly honed skills as an editor and a writer for these publications, a discipline that is hard for people like me who pretend to be able to write, to understand. But then when that scaffolding fell away, those brands were no longer part of your life, there was a whole bunch of things that you had to kind of fend for yourself on, things that you're naturally less good at. And I think that those are things that for many people are skills that they have to get good at to break through a certain level of awareness of what their work is. And I think that what I'm pleased about in your story is that those things worked out sufficiently well that now you can go back to using the very skills that were honed 10 years ago as an editor of Time, for example. I sent William the 25th principle, And
this is in Guy's annual report, which I edit.
And maybe one day we will actually do a kind of a deep dive on what Guy's writing looks like before William gets to it and after it. I don't think that anybody understands the precision that goes into making those prose so beautifully clear. And what happens is that we just think we're smart because we understand what we're reading. We don't realize that there's an enormous amount of work that has gone into ensuring that the reader understands easily the ideas that are being conveyed. And yes, Guy has some good ideas, but boy, is he bad at conveying them. You have no clue, actually, and I think it would be an interesting thing to do. In the same way that this interview is probably easier to listen to because of the precise and careful preparatory work that you've done.
Thank you, Guy. And I'm going to finish with one final conclusion based on what you just said, which is that I think sometimes people read your book or read my book or listen to us speaking and think, oh, these guys have it figured out and they're smart or they've been successful or something. And I actually think what's really the truth that I draw from our careers over the last 25 years is that we've been indomitably persistent despite all of the failures and setbacks and disappointments where you have a period like me getting laid off from Time or the job I had afterwards, which I detested, or you going through Horsehead or the disappointment over Reysas or the worry over the war in Ukraine. And the consistent thing, it goes back to something that Tom Gaynor said to me when I interviewed him during COVID. And he said, one foot in front of another. And I said to him, can you elaborate on that? And he's like, no, one foot in front of the other. That's what I've done all through my life, and it's what I'm doing now. And I think it's worth emphasizing this because there are lots of secret sources, but really the ultimate secret source is that tremendous perseverance, even when you feel a little lost. And when Guy and I were talking earlier this week about friends of his who've just taken a 75% hit and an 80% hit in funds that they run or stocks that they manage, you were saying, what I tell them is, be kind to yourself. We're human. We make these mistakes and you pick yourself up and you move forward.